This is my piece of material that we're going to make that mullion with. Now I want to route each edge. I ripped it a little bit wide and then I turned it up on the edge and ran through the planer to get rid of the saw curse. Now the second thing that's important is don't get ahead of yourself. We want this to be around 3/8 to 7/16 thick, but if I had thinned it down to that now, when I get ready to run this router bit on the edge, the bearing wouldn't have enough to ride on. So you want to, rip it, clean the edges up, route the edges, and then thin it down last. So it seems like most of the time when I make my first pass on a board like this, that little pieces of sawdust or fibers of wood kind of get on the edge of the board and the bearing runs over them and makes it a little bit rough. So what I usually do is run it the first time and then I come back and rub it to get all those little pieces of fiber off there, and then run one more time, which gives me that really clean cut that I'm looking for. So I'm ready to nail this custom piece in place. Now, it's really got a dainty, fragile edge there, so I'm definitely going to be wanting to use my 23 gauge headless pins. And I've made it a thickness where it just about flushes out with the inside edge of this casing trim. That's another thing that I should have mentioned. I was going for a thickness that would die into that edge. And this is giving some strength to that header. Of course, when the glass gets in there and that glass is siliconed in, it's going to really make this rigid. So one of the things that this mullion trim does is it just makes this look like it's one total piece of millwork. And that's really our goal. I didn't want this to look like a couple of components. I wanted it to look like one big piece of millwork. So when we get a piece of glass in here, this is really gonna look nice. And the scale is so much better being tall like this. But there's one more thing I wanna do to this opening. And sometimes we'll pick selected kind of important openings in the house and just dress up the trim detail around them a little bit more using a product called a Backband. And that's simply another thicker piece of trim that we're going to attach right back here. It'll just beef this up a little more. This is a room that's going to be the study. It's going to have some cabinetry, a Murphy bed in it, and it's very public, very visible. So it's one of those openings I want to dress up just a little bit more. So this is a piece of trim called a Backband. And again, you add it to a casing trim to kind of beef it up, usually in a special location. So here's how it works. This piece just nests right over the casing profile, and man, does that look good, especially when you get a miter joint. This looks good, but to me, that looks better. Of course, I'm a trim guy. But there are a couple challenges that you need to know. This can be a little bit hard to nail in place. So what I learned pretty quick when we started doing this is I want to put an 18 gauge brad through the outside like this, but then I come with a 23 gauge right here in the inside, and that's probably one of the most challenging applications that I use a 23 gauge for. So I've got to have a really good fine nose piece and high quality fasteners too, because you don't want them curling and coming out in places that are unexpected. The only other thing that I learned, I can't explain this, but to get a good miter joint up there, I've always found that I need to raise it up just maybe a 1/16 taller than lining up with the miter on the casing trim. You have to cheat it up just a little bit to make sure the joint closes. Don't understand why, just know I got to do it. So right there, that lines up with the miter, but what I found is if I nail it there, it doesn't work. So what I want to do is raise it up about to there, and then I'm just going to drive one of these 1.5" 18 gauge brads back through from that side. The next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to bring my 23 gauge and just shoot right there. So I'm literally shooting this 23 gauge headless pin within 1/8 of an inch of the edge of this trim, and I'm angling it that way. There's just no way that I could attach that without using a 23 gauge tool. And most importantly, not just any 23 gauge tool, I need a really good one. So every time I'm using Backband, I stay focused and I make sure that I'm using my Grex. I'm just going to work my way back across this end. I'm nailing down through the top first, and then I'm reaching through there with my headless pins. Well, that pretty well finishes up. I'm going to get down off this ladder. I want to close the doors and see what this looks like. Well, when it comes to trim work, I've never been accused of being objective, but I just love the way this looks. And I especially like the fact that I took a couple pretty simple components, combined them, and ended up with something that really looks great. And this is just almost like the centerpiece of this living room. I can't wait to see it painted with a piece of glass in there and some cabinetry behind it.